The obsidian palace was drowning in light and drowning in lies. 1,000 crystal tiers hung from the massive chandeliers of the grand hall, casting fractured, icy light across the marble floor. It was the night of the winter ball, the most vital gathering of the sovereign year. For the sovereign duchy of Oak-Ivan, this was not merely a celebration of the frost. It was a desperate theater of power. And the man sitting upon the raised dais, Sovereign Duke Julian of House Valerius, was bleeding authority with every passing hour. Julian sat rigid in his high-backed chair, his broad shoulders encased in a midnight blue velvet coat heavy with silver epaulettes. His fingers, pale and tense, continually drifted to the silver pocket watch inside his breast pocket. He checked the time. He checked the room. He checked the eyes of the nobles gathered before him. He was a man born to rule, yet perpetually terrified that the room would one day realize he did not know how to. And standing silently at the very edge of the dais, blending into the shadows of the heavy velvet drapes, was the woman who actually knew exactly how to rule it. Lady Clara did not look like a duchess. She had never been permitted to. She wore a plain, unadorned ash gray silk gown that swallowed her slender frame, a garment designed by the royal dressmakers to ensure she faded into the background. Her dark chestnut hair was pinned back modestly, stripping her of any courtly vanity. Her hands were crossed in front of her. She wore white lace gloves, pristine except for a faint, dark smudge of ink on the edge of her right index finger. It was the mark of a woman who had spent the last 3 nights awake in the freezing royal archives, auditing the crumbling ledgers that kept Julian's kingdom from outright starvation. Clara's warm hazel eyes observed the ballroom with absolute, terrifying stillness. She did not weep for her isolation. She did not fidget. She only held a worn, heavy leather portfolio pressed tightly against her chest. "She is an eyesore, Your Grace." The whisper was slick, oiled with false deference. Grand Chancellor Thorne stood just behind the Duke's chair. The older man leaned down, his heavy black robes of state rustling like dry leaves. Thorne had a narrow, hollow face and black, hooded eyes that missed nothing and poisoned everything. "The northern lords are watching," Thorne murmured, his breath brushing the silver epaulettes of Julian's coat. "They look at her and they see weakness." A penniless ward elevated to the dais. "She diminishes the royal table." "She diminishes you, my lord." Julian's jaw clenched. The strong, commanding ridge of his brow darkened. He hated the way the nobles whispered behind their jeweled fans. He hated the fragility of his own crown, but mostly he hated that Thorne was right. Clara was a symbol of his father's charitable madness. A forced marriage to a girl from a ruined neighboring realm. She brought no army. She brought no gold. Or so Julian had been told. He did not know about the original document resting inside the worn leather portfolio Clara was clutching. He did not know about the Eastern wax seal hidden within its pages. He only saw a quiet, boring woman making him look soft in front of wolves. "The banquet is about to be served." Thorne continued smoothly, stepping back. "The high table must project absolute supremacy. The lords will not respect a ruler who elevates a mouse to the seat of a lion." Julian stood up. The movement was sharp enough to silence the immediate area around the dais. The string quartet in the balcony faltered for half a second before catching their rhythm. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the sovereign. Clara did not flinch. She only turned her head, her soft oval face remaining perfectly composed as her husband walked toward her. "Clara," Julian said. His voice was clipped, authoritative, echoing slightly against the cold marble pillars. He pitched it not for her, but for the listening ears of the high nobility below. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied. Her voice was low, melodic, and entirely steady. "The high table is reserved for the heads of state and the high lords of the council this evening," Julian said, his deep-set gray eyes refusing to truly meet hers. "Your presence here confuses the diplomatic seating." Clara looked at the empty gilded chair beside his throne. Her chair, the seat of the Duchess. "I am your wife, Julian," she said so quietly that only he and Thorne could hear. It was not a plea. It was a statement of legal fact. "You are a distraction," Julian countered, his insecurity hardening into cruelty. He raised his voice, ensuring the lords in the front rows heard the command. "The protocol of Oak-Haven requires strength tonight. I will not have my court insulted by the presence of a charity case at the royal table." A ripple of low laughter echoed from Lady Vivienne's circle in the center of the hall. The Chancellor smirked. Clara's breath caught against the rigid bones of her corset, but her spine remained as straight as a forged blade. "You wish for me to leave the hall?" Clara asked. Julian looked down at her ash-gray gown at the ink stain on her glove, at the worn leather portfolio that offended his aesthetic sensibilities. He felt a fleeting surge of power, a false rush of control. "No," Julian said, his voice ringing out across the sudden, terrible hush of the ballroom. "You may stay for the feast, but you will not sit here. You may sit with the servants in the lower gallery. That is where you blend in best." For one long agonizing breath, the Grand Chandelier Hall forgot how to speak. The cruelty of the command was absolute. A reigning duke had just banished his lawfully wedded wife to the servant quarters in front of the entire kingdom. Julian waited for the tears. He braced for the quiet, pathetic sobbing he associated with weak women. He expected her to drop her head in shame and scurry away into the dark. Clara did not drop her head. She looked up at him, and in her hazel eyes, the banks of a long-held fire finally cracked open. She did not see a king. She saw a boy, terrified of the dark, burning down his own house to keep warm. Her hands tightened around the leather portfolio. "As you command, your grace," Clara said. Her voice was not broken. It was a verdict. She did not bow. She did not curtsy. She simply turned her back on the throne of Oakhaven. The silk of her grey gown swept softly over the cold marble as she walked toward the grand archway leading to the servants' corridors. She walked with a measured, ancient dignity, her chin lifted, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Julian watched her go, feeling a sudden, hollow ache in his chest that he quickly buried beneath his pride. He turned back to his court, expecting to see admiration. He expected to see a kingdom bowing to his strength. He did not notice the old Duke of the Northern Marches staring intently at the leather portfolio tucked under Clara's arm. He did not notice the sudden, terrifying silence falling over the most powerful men in the room. And he did not know that by sending Clara to the shadows, he had just handed over his crown. The Grand Chandelier Hall was so silent that the soft brush of Clara's gray silk gown against the marble sounded like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who had nothing left to run from. The cold air of the massive ballroom pressed against her face, but she kept her chin perfectly level. Beneath her stiff corset, her heartbeat was a slow, heavy drum. She did not look back at the raised days. She did not look at the sovereign duke who had just stripped her of her dignity in front of the entire realm. Her white lace gloves, still bearing the faint ink stain of her midnight labors, tightened around the worn leather portfolio. As she moved past the long, velvet, draped tables of the high nobility, hundreds of eyes tracked her. Some held pity. Many held the cruel, glittering amusement of a court that fed on humiliation. Lady Vivienne fluttered her jeweled fan, hiding a triumphant smile, but not everyone was smiling. Seated near the center aisle was Lord Stirling, the aging Duke of the Northern Marches. He was a man who had survived 3 reigns, a man who measured power not in velvet coats or silver epaulettes, but in gold, grain, and iron. He had watched Julian ascend the throne with the arrogant blindness of youth, and he had watched Clara for 3 years quietly manage the rotting finances of a bankrupt duchy from the shadows of the royal archives. As Clara passed his table, a sudden draft from the high windows caught the flap of her leather portfolio. For a fraction of a second, the worn leather lifted. Lord Stirling's sharp, pale eyes caught a glimpse of what lay inside. It was a flash of crimson, a heavy, intricate wax seal pressed into ancient vellum. The crest was not the wolf of House Valerius. It was the rising phoenix of the annexed Eastern realm, the sovereign treaty. The old duke's breath hitched in his chest. His gloved hand, holding a crystal goblet of wine, froze in mid-air. He knew about the treaty. Few of the older lords did, but Stirling had been there when Julian's father had signed it. The Duchy of Oakhaven was drowning in foreign debt. The Eastern realm, though supposedly conquered, held the sovereign wealth that kept Oakhaven's armies fed and its nobles in their castles. The marriage to Clara was never an act of royal charity. It was a chain of survival. The treaty stated explicitly that the financial sovereignty of the Eastern realm remained entirely in the hands of its last surviving heir, provided she was treated as a ruling equal. Julian had just banished that heir to the servants' quarters. He had just broken the treaty. Lord Stirling set his crystal goblet down on the white linen. His hand was trembling, not from age, but from the sudden, terrifying realization of what Julian had just done to the kingdom. Without Clara's signature, the foreign banks would call in the duchy's debts by morning. Without Clara, half the nobility in this room would be penniless before the winter snow melted. She held the deeds. She held the kingdom's lifeblood, inside that battered leather case. The old Duke did not look at Julian. He looked at Clara's straight, retreating back. He saw the quiet, terrifying authority of a woman who had just let a foolish boy hang himself with his own pride. With a loud, deliberate scrape that echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall, Lord Stirling pushed his heavy oak chair back. He stood up. He was a tall man, his chest heavy with military medals. He stepped out from behind his table and stepped into the center aisle. He did not bow to the throne. He turned his back on the raised dais, and with slow, heavy footsteps, the most powerful military commander in Oakham began to follow the ash, grey-gowned toward the servants' corridor. A ripple of shock went through the room. On the dais, Grand Chancellor Thorne frowned, his dark, hooded eyes narrowing. Stirling forgets himself. Thorne hissed to Julian. The old fool is drunk. Julian's hand moved instinctively to his silver pocket watch, his thumb rubbing the engraved metal. Let him go. Julian muttered, though a cold knot was forming in his stomach. He has always been eccentric. But it did not end with Lord Stirling. The Minister of Coin, a shrewd, nervous man who had spent the last 3 years receiving flawless, mathematically perfect ledgers from Clara's private study, saw Stirling move. The minister knew exactly why the old Duke was leaving. He knew that the gold in the royal treasury was an illusion propped up entirely by the quiet woman in the grey dress. The Minister of Coin stood up. He buttoned his coat, gave a curt nod to his pale wife, and stepped into the aisle to follow. Then stood the Earl of the Western Ports, whose trade routes were secured solely by Eastern merchant alliances. Then stood the Master of Laws, who had audited the marriage contract and knew the lethal fine print of the 4th article. The scraping of heavy wooden chairs began to multiply. It started as a few isolated sounds and quickly grew into a cascade. The high nobles, the ones who actually ran the infrastructure, the armies, and the banks of Oakhaven were rising. They did not speak. They did not shout treason. They simply stood, leaving their untouched crystal goblets and gold-plated plates behind. Clara reached the grand archway that led out of the chandelier hall. The light ended abruptly here, giving way to the cold, shadow-draped stone of the lower servant galleries. She stepped into the dark. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy footsteps of Oakhaven's true power structure followed. They marched out of the light. They marched away from the chandeliers, away from the glittering vanity of a dying court, and into the freezing shadows to sit with a banished woman. Up on the dais, the silence had turned into something suffocating. Julian stood frozen by his throne. His arrogant posture was suddenly rigid, with an entirely different emotion. He watched the center of the room empty out. Dozens of chairs sat abandoned. The entire left flank of the royal banquet tables was deserted. What is this? Julian's voice cracked, the authoritative timbre vanishing. He gripped the arm of his throne. Thorne, what is happening? Chancellor Thorne's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. He stared at the empty chairs, the truth of his buried lies suddenly rising to choke him. Half the nobility had just left the royal winter ball, and they had not left for their carriages. They had walked into the servants' quarters. The string quartet in the high balcony had stopped playing. Without the music, the Grand Chandelier Hall was entirely stripped of its magic. It was no longer a theater of sovereign power. It was merely a massive, drafty room filled with cold marble and abandoned gold. Sovereign Duke Julian stood frozen beside his high-backed throne. His gloved hand gripped the carved armrest so tightly that his knuckles ached. He stared out over the sea of tables. The entire left flank of the royal banquet was empty. Heavy oak chairs were pushed back, sitting at crooked angles like scattered gravestones. Untouched crystal goblets caught the fractured light of the chandeliers. The silence in the room was not the respectful hush of a court waiting for its ruler to speak. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a kingdom that had just held its breath and refused to exhale. An orchestrated insult. Grand Chancellor Thorne stepped closer to the throne. His voice was a low, urgent hiss, carefully pitched. So the remaining nobles could not hear the panic bleeding into his tone. Do not let them see you waver, your grace. Thorne murmured, his black robes brushing against the dais steps. This was planned. Lord Stirling has been looking for an excuse to challenge your authority since your father passed. He used the Duchess's dismissal as a convenient theatrical exit. Julian slowly turned his head to look at his chancellor. Half the room just walked out, Thorne, Julian said. His voice was hollow. They did not walk out to their carriages. They walked into the servants' corridors. They are old fools? Thorne counted smoothly. His hooded black eyes darted across the remaining guests, calculating the damage. They cling to the old ways. They test your strength, my lord. If you flinch now, if you send guards to drag them back, You legitimize their little rebellion. Sit down. Command the feast to begin. Show them that the Duchy of Oakhaven does not halt its breathing for a few petulant lords. Julian wanted to believe him. It was the easiest thing in the world to believe the lies of a man who told you that you were strong. Julian unclasped his tense grip from the throne. He smoothed the front of his midnight blue velvet coat, adjusting the silver epaulets that suddenly felt entirely too heavy for his shoulders. Slowly, deliberately, he sat back down. He raised his hand, a sharp, commanding gesture. The master of ceremonies swallowed hard and slammed his golden staff against the marble floor. "Let the winter feast commence," the man announced, though his voice cracked on the final word. The string quartet hastily picked up their instruments. They began to play a lively waltz, but the tempo was too fast, the notes slightly frantic. Servants emerged from the side doors, carrying massive silver platters of roasted meats and winter fruits, their eyes darting nervously toward the empty chairs. Lady Vivienne, seated at the center table among the loyalists, offered a bright, overly loud laugh. She leaned toward the Duke of the Southern Vales, her diamonds glittering under the light. "Such a relief to have the air cleared," she said, her voice carrying toward the dais. "The high table feels so much more refined now." Julian looked at her. He saw the calculation in her pale blue eyes. He saw the ambition. An hour ago, her flattery would have warmed his ego. Now it only made his stomach turn, because Julian was finally looking past the velvet and the diamonds. He was looking at the empty chairs. Lord Stirling had left. The man who commanded the northern garrisons. The Earl of the Western Ports had left. The man who controlled the trade ships that brought grain to the capital. The Master of Laws had left, and most terrifying of all, the Minister of Coin had left. Julian reached into his breast pocket. His fingers closed around his silver pocket watch. He pulled it out, flicking the engraved lid open with his thumb. The ticking of the small gears felt incredibly loud against his palm. Tick, tick, tick. Why would the Minister of Coin leave? The man was a nervous, easily frightened bureaucrat. He was not a rebel. He was a man who lived and died by the ledgers. He would never risk his position for a political stunt unless he knew something about the duchy's survival that Julian did not. Julian's eyes drifted toward the dark archway at the back of the hall, the entrance to the servants' corridor, where Clara had gone. Clara, who wore ash-gray silk so she wouldn't stand out. Clara, who always had ink stains on her gloves. Clara, who spent her nights in the freezing royal archives instead of attending court gossips. Julian closed the pocket watch with a sharp snap. At that exact moment, a minor clerk from the royal treasury hurried through the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall. The young man was pale, sweating despite the winter chill. He bypassed the lower tables, weaving through the servants, and practically threw himself at the base of the royal dais. Thorne stepped forward immediately, his face darkening with rage. "You dare interrupt the sovereign feast?" The Chancellor hissed. "Get back to your quarters, boy." I cannot, my Lord Chancellor." The clerk stammered, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the marble. He held up a thick envelope sealed with black wax. "A dispatch rider just arrived from the border. It is from the Iron Bank of the continent. It is marked for the sovereign's eyes only. Immediate attention." Julian stood up. The cold dread in his stomach crystallized into ice. "Bring it here," Julian commanded. Thorne moved to intercept the letter, his hand reaching out. "Your Grace, surely state business can wait until morning. The guests are watching." "Bring it to me, Thorne," Julian repeated. His voice dropped an octave. It was not the arrogant bark of a boy playing king. It was the dangerous, quiet tone of a man realizing he was blind. Thorne hesitated, then snatched the letter from the clerk and handed it to Julian. Julian broke the black wax seal. He unfolded the heavy parchment. His deep-set gray eyes scanned the elegant, ruthless handwriting of the foreign creditors to the sovereign Duke of Oakhaven. "As per the stipulations of the Continental Loan, the quarterly grace period has expired. We require the immediate countersignature of the primary guarantor to extend the sovereign debt. Failure to produce the signature by dawn will result in the immediate calling of all loans and the freezing of Oakhaven's trade ports." Julian stared at the words, the primary guarantor. "Thorne?" Julian said slowly, not taking his eyes off the parchment. "Where is the Minister of Coin? I need him to explain this." Thorne swallowed. The oily confidence was finally slipping from his narrow face. "Your Grace." "The Minister of Coin?" He walked out. Julian finished for him. Julian looked up from the letter. He looked past the Chancellor. He looked past the nervous musicians, past Lady Vivienne's frozen smile, and past the abandoned crystal goblets. He looked at the dark archway leading to the servants' corridor. The crown of Oakhaven wasn't sitting on his head. It was sitting in a worn leather portfolio in the hands of the quiet woman he had just banished to the dark. The air in the lower galleries smelled of wood smoke, roasting venison, and damp stone. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the heavy perfume and beeswax candles of the grand chandelier hall. Down here, beneath the glittering illusion of the obsidian palace, the true machinery of the kingdom operated in the dark. The stone floors were uneven, worn smooth by centuries of rushing servants. The walls wept with winter condensation. Clara walked down the narrow, torch-lit corridor. Her ash-gray silk gown brushed against the cold floor, picking up traces of soot and flour. She did not weep. She did not tremble. The corset that bound her ribs felt tight, but her breathing was perfectly even. She walked into the massive, vaulted palace kitchens. The frantic energy of the room instantly died. Dozens of cooks, scullery maids, and footmen froze in their tracks. A boy dropped a copper pot. It clattered loudly against the stone, spinning in circles before coming to a stop. They stared at the Duchess of Oakhaven, the highest-ranking woman in the realm, standing amidst the hanging garlic and butchered pheasants. Clara found a long, scarred wooden table where the kitchen staff took their hasty meals. She pulled out a rough-hewn bench and sat down. She placed her worn leather portfolio on the scarred wood. Her hands, clad in white lace gloves with that single, faint ink stain, rested calmly over the leather flap. "Carry on," Clara said quietly to the terrified head cook. "The sovereign duke requires his feast. Do not let the meat burn on my account." Before the cook could stammer a reply, the heavy wooden doors at the top of the servants' stairwell swung open. The rhythmic, heavy sound of leather boots on stone echoed down the corridor. It was not the hurried, light steps of servants. It was the measured, authoritative march of men who commanded armies. The kitchen staff pressed themselves against the damp brick walls, their eyes wide with disbelief. Into the smoky, soot-stained kitchen walked Lord Stirling, his chest heavy with gold military medals. Behind him came the Minister of Coin in his velvet doublet, wiping sweat from his brow. Then came the Earl of the Western Ports, the Master of Laws, and a dozen other high lords of the realm. Their jewel-toned velvet coats, diamond pins, and silver-buckled boots looked entirely absurd in the raw, brutal light of the kitchen fires. They did not look at the servants. They did not look at the hanging meat or the boiling cauldrons. They looked only at the woman sitting on the wooden bench. Lord Stirling stopped a few paces from the rough table. The old duke looked at Clara's ash-gray gown, at the dust gathering on its hem. He looked at her calm, dark green eyes. He saw no humiliation there. He saw only the terrifying patience of a queen. Slowly, Lord Stirling unclasped his ceremonial sword from his belt. He laid it on the kitchen table, right next to a pile of unwashed root vegetables. Then the most feared military commander in Oakhaven stepped back, lowered his heavy frame, and dropped to one knee on the cold stone floor. The clatter of armor and the rustle of heavy velvet filled the room. The Minister of Coin knelt. The Earl of the Western Ports knelt. The Master of Laws knelt. Down the line, one by one, the true power of the Duchy of Oakhaven bowed their heads in the soot-stained kitchen. "You are not uninvited, Your Grace," Lord Stirling said. His rough, gravelly voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "And you do not sit alone. Where the true sovereign sits, the court follows." Clara looked at the kneeling men. She did not act surprised. She did not offer false modesty. She had earned their loyalty in the freezing silence of the royal archives, auditing the ledgers they depended on, saving their lands from foreclosure, while her husband danced above. "Rise, my lords," Clara said gently. "The floor is damp, and your coats are far too expensive to ruin." Stirling stood, a grim smile touching his lips, the others gathering around the scarred wooden table, as if it were the grandest council chamber in the world. "The boy on the throne has lost his mind," the Earl of the Western Ports muttered, pulling up a stool meant for a scullery maid, "to shame you before the northern lords. He has no idea what he just broke. He knows nothing, because Chancellor Thorne feeds him comfortable lies." The Minister of Coin said, his voice trembling with anxious energy. He stepped closer to the table, looking urgently at Clara. "Your Grace, a dispatch rider arrived from the border just as we were leaving the hall." The Black Wax. "The Continental Iron Bank." Clara's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the leather flap of her portfolio. "The quarterly grace period," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," the minister said, swallowing hard. "The foreign creditors are calling the sovereign debt. They demand the primary guarantor's countersignature by dawn, or they freeze the ports and seize the royal treasury. Julian has the letter now. He will realize the treasury is empty. He will realize the signature they require is not his." Clara slowly pulled the strap of the worn leather portfolio. The heavy flap fell open. Reaching inside, she withdrew a thick stack of ancient vellum. At the bottom of the documents hung a massive, unbroken wax seal. It was deep crimson, stamped with the rising phoenix of the annexed Eastern realm. The sovereign treaty. The lords stared at it in reverent silence. It was the only thing standing between Oak Heaven and total ruin. My father signed this treaty when his kingdom was broken, Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, cold authority. She traced the edge of the phoenix seal with her ink-stained glove. He surrendered his crown to Julian's father to save his people, but he ensured the financial sovereignty remained with my bloodline. Article 4. Article 4? The Master of Laws quoted from memory, his voice hushed. Should the ruling duke fail to honor the Eastern heir as a sovereign equal, the financial partnership is voided. The debt of the realm reverts to the sole ownership of the Eastern heir. Clara looked up. Her eyes met Lord Sterling's. Julian banished me to the servants' quarters in front of the entire nobility, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. He publicly repudiated my standing as his equal. The treaty is broken. The Minister of Coin wrung his hands. If you do not sign the Iron Bank's extension tonight, Your Grace, Oakhven is bankrupt. By sunrise, the Duke will not be able to pay his own palace guards. The foreign armies will have legal right to march. I know, Clara said. She took the heavy vellum, folded it carefully, and slid it back into the worn leather portfolio. She closed the flap and fastened the buckle. The snap of the metal echoed in the quiet kitchen. Your Grace, Lord Sterling asked softly, what are your orders? Clara looked at the roaring fire in the massive kitchen hearth. She thought of Julian checking his silver pocket watch, desperate to look like a king, while standing on a rotting floor. She thought of the 3 years she had spent holding that floor up in the dark. My orders are simple, Lord Sterling, Clara said. She turned back to the men, her chin lifting with the undeniable grace of a true queen. Let the sun rise. Let the banks call the debt. Let the Duke of Oakhven learn exactly what it costs to send a queen to the shadows. She folded her hands over the portfolio. I will not sign it. Dawn came to the obsidian palace not with the warmth of the sun, but with the color of a bruised iron blade. The winter light crept through the high, frosted windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the empty grand chandelier hall. The crystal fixtures hung dead and unlit. The tables were a graveyard of congealing meats, overturned goblets, and the lingering scent of stale wine. The winter feast, meant to solidify a sovereign's absolute power, had ended in a quiet, devastating mass desertion. Up in the royal sovereign's study, the air was thick with the suffocating reality of mourning. Sovereign Duke Julian stood by the heavy glass window, looking down at the palace courtyard. He had not slept. He had not changed out of his midnight blue velvet coat, though the silver epaulets now felt like lead weights driving him into the floor. His fingers were locked around his silver pocket watch, the metal slick with cold sweat. In the courtyard below, a carriage of black iron and polished ebony wood had just rolled through the palace gates. It bore no royal crest. It bore the heavy, interlocking coin sigil of the Continental Iron Bank. They are here, Julian said. His voice was a dry, hollow rasp. Behind him, Grand Chancellor Thorne paced the length of the Persian rug. The older man's black robes looked less like the garments of state and more like a shroud. The oily confidence that usually coded Thorne's words had evaporated entirely. We must buy time, Your Grace, Thorne said, his voice tight. Send the palace guard to the lower galleries. Arrest Lord Sterling for treason. Arrest the Minister of Coin. Force them back to their posts. Once the nobility sees you wield the sword, order will be restored. Julian turned away from the window. His deep-set gray eyes were bloodshot. Arrest them with whose army, Thorne? Julian asked softly. Sterling commands the vanguard. If I send the palace guard to chain him, we will have a civil war on the marble steps before noon, and that does not solve the carriage currently unhitching in my courtyard. Julian stepped toward his massive oak desk. Why must pay the quarterly grace? The letter demanded a signature, but foreign bankers worship gold above ink. Open the royal vaults. Drain the winter reserves. Pay the interest in physical bullion and tell them the primary guarantor is indisposed. A timid knock at the study doors interrupted him. A junior clerk from the treasury, a boy no older than 20, trembling violently in his oversized woolen coat, stepped into the room. He was the highest-ranking financial officer left in the upper palace. Speak, Julian commanded. Your Grace, the boy stammered, staring at the floor. The envoys of the Iron Bank await in the antechamber. They demand the countersigned sovereign treaty. Tell them the treaty is delayed. Go to the lower vaults and authorize the transfer of the winter gold reserves to cover the grace period. Julian ordered, reaching for a quill. The boy did not move. He swallowed so hard the sound was audible in the quiet room. Your Grace, I cannot. You have the sovereign command! Thorne barked, stepping forward. I cannot, my Lord Chancellor, because there is no gold. The clerk whispered. The boy finally looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. The royal vaults are empty. They have been empty for 2 years. Julian's hand froze, hovering over the parchment. The quill snapped between his fingers. What did you say? Julian breathed. The duchy operates entirely on foreign credit. Your Grace, the clerk explained, his voice breaking. The Minister of Coin and the Duchess. They managed the ledgers. They moved numbers, delayed payments, traded eastern shipping routes to float the palace's expenses. There is no physical gold left in Oakhaven, only the debt, and the debt is only secured by the treaty. Julian felt the floor tilt beneath his boots. Empty. His grand feasts, his velvet coats, his silver epaulettes, the very marble of his palace. It was all an illusion. A house of cards balanced on a blade. The ledgers, Julian said, his breathing suddenly shallow. Where are the master ledgers? I need to see them. I need to see what my father left me. The Minister of Coin does not keep them, Your Grace. The clerk said miserably. The Duchess kept them. In her private study. Julian did not wait for Thorne to speak. He pushed past the Chancellor, threw open the study doors, and strode down the long, echoing corridor toward the east wing. He had never visited Clara's private study. She had claimed a small, unused archive room at the end of a drafty hallway shortly after their marriage. He had thought it an odd, reclusive habit. He had thought she was hiding from the nobility out of shame. He reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The room was freezing. There was no hearth, only a small, rusted iron stove that had long gone cold. The walls were lined with towering shelves of rotting parchment. In the center of the room sat a plain wooden desk. There were no velvet cushions here, no gilded mirrors. A single candle stub sat in a pool of hardened wax on the desk. This was where she had been. While he drank wine under the chandeliers, Clara had sat in this freezing room, wearing her ash-gray gown, her fingers stained with ink, holding an entire kingdom together in the dark. Julian rushed to the desk. He pulled open the drawers. He scoured the shelves. Where are they? He muttered, throwing aside blank parchments. Where are the ledgers? The desk was completely empty. Julian stopped. He stared at the smooth, scratched wood of the desk surface. He remembered the night before. He remembered Clara standing on the royal dais, her white lace gloves marked with ink, clutching a heavy, worn leather portfolio against her chest. I am your wife, Julian. She had not begged him. She had warned him. Julian's eyes caught a crumpled piece of heavy vellum resting at the bottom of the waste bin. He reached down and pulled it out. It was an old draft of the royal marriage contract. The ink was faded, but the words of the fourth article were perfectly legible. The financial sovereignty of the Eastern realm remains in the sole possession of the true heir. Should the ruling duke fail to honor her as a sovereign equal, the partnership is voided. The debt reverts to her. Julian stared at the word hire. Not a charity case, not a penniless ward. Clarissa of the Eastern Realm was the primary guarantor. She was the only reason the Iron Bank had ever loaned Oakhaven a single copper coin. She owned the debt, she owned the kingdom, and he had banished her to the servants' quarters. Julian slowly lowered the crumpled parchment to the desk. The silence of the freezing study pressed against his eardrums. He had not just insulted his wife. He had publicly shattered the only legal shield protecting his throne. He had done exactly what the iron shod boots in the courtyard were waiting for. Oakhaven was officially, legally bankrupt. Julian turned around. Chancellor Thorne stood in the doorway, his chest heaving from the brisk walk, his black eyes darting nervously around the empty study. She took them, Julian said. The words tasted like ash. Thorne opened his mouth to speak, to spin another lie, to deflect the blame, but Julian looked at him, and for the first time in his sheltered, arrogant life, the Duke of Oakhaven saw clearly in the dark. The freezing air in the small archive room seemed to solidify around them. Sovereign Duke, Julian stood behind the scratched, empty wooden desk. In his right hand, he held the crumpled draft of the sovereign treaty. His knuckles were white. He looked at Grand Chancellor Thorne, really looked at him for the first time in his reign. He did not see a wise mentor. He saw a parasite wrapped in heavy black silk. You knew, Julian said. The words did not echo. They dropped into the cold room like stones. Thorne stepped fully into the study, his hooded black eyes darting toward the empty shelves. He attempted to pull the oily, deferential mask back over his features. Your Grace, the Duchess has committed high treason. She has stolen the master ledgers of Oakhaven. We must send the guard. She didn't steal them, Thorne. Julian interrupted. his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. He held up the crumpled vellum. You cannot steal what legally belongs to you. Article 4. The financial sovereignty of the Eastern realm remains in the sole possession of the true heir. Clarissa. Thorne's jaw tightened. The mask began to slip. My father did not take her in as a penniless ward. Julian continued, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a rising, suffocating rage aimed as much at himself as at the man before him. He married me to a queen to save this bankrupt duchy, and you buried the truth of it. You told me she was a charity case. You told me to hide her in the shadows. Why? To protect your crown, Thorne snapped, his own temper finally fracturing the polished veneer of the courtier. He stepped closer to the desk, his black robes sweeping over the dusty floorboards. To protect House Valerius! Would you have the high nobility know that their lands, their armies, their very wine is paid for by the conquered Eastern bloodline? Would you have them bow to a foreign woman? They are bowing to her right now! Julian roared. The sound shattered the heavy silence of the East Wing. Thorne flinched, stepping back. They are bowing to her in the soot and the damp of my own kitchens, Julian said, his breathing ragged. Because while you were whispering poison in my ear, telling me how strong I was, she was sitting in this freezing room keeping us alive. Julian looked around the miserable, unlit study. He looked at the rusted iron stove that had no wood. He looked at the single melted candle stub on the desk. The physical reality of Clara's sacrifice hit him harder than the threat of the Continental Iron Bank. He thought of his midnight blue velvet coat. He thought of the grand feasts, the crystal chandeliers, the silver epaulets he wore to project power. All of it was bought with her exhaustion. She had frozen in the dark so he could shine in the light, and when she had finally emerged from the dark, carrying the weight of the kingdom in a worn leather portfolio, he had told her she was not fit to sit at his table. She possessed the legal right to veto every decree I made. Julian whispered, the horror of his own ignorance washing over him. She owned the sovereign debt. She could have crushed me on our wedding day. But she didn't. She spent 3 years balancing ledgers she didn't owe, saving nobles who mocked her. She is a manipulator. Thorne sneered, his panic making him reckless. She waited for the perfect moment to humiliate you. She is no Queen Julian. She is an accountant playing at royalty. You are the sovereign duke. Issue a royal decree. Void the treaty entirely. Declare her a traitor to the crown and seize the eastern assets by force! Julian looked at Thorne with absolute disgust. Size what assets? Julian asked softly. There is no gold, Thorne. There is only credit. And the Iron Bank does not care about my royal decrees. They care about her signature. You hid the crown law to make me dependent on you. You let me humiliate the only true monarch in this palace because you were terrified of a woman who was smarter than you. Thorne drew himself up to his full height, his narrow face twisting into a mask of pure arrogance. I served your father. I built the political alliances that keep the northern lords in line. You cannot run Oakhaven without me, boy. You do not have the stomach for it. Julian stared at the chancellor. Then, with a terrifying, deliberate calmness, Julian walked around the desk. He stopped inches from Thorne. He did not yell. He did not draw a sword. He simply reached out and grasped the heavy gold chain of office that hung around Thorne's neck. You are right about one thing, Julian said softly. I have been a boy. A blind, arrogant boy playing with a crown he did not earn. With a sudden, violent jerk, Julian yanked the chain. The heavy gold link snapped. The sound was sharp and metallic. The grand seal of the chancellor clattered to the floor, rolling across the dusty wood until it hit the rusted iron stove. Thorne gasped, his hands flying to his neck in shock. You dare! I am the sovereign Duke of Oakhaven. Julian said, his deep, set grey eyes burning with a cold, absolute authority he had never wielded before. And my first true decree is your ruin. Julian turned his head toward the open doorway. Guards! 2 palace guards in silver breastplates, who had been lingering nervously at the end of the hall, hurried into the study. They looked at the broken gold chain on the floor, then at the Duke. Strip this man of his robes. Julian commanded, his voice echoing like iron. Arrest him for high treason, forgery of state documents, and the deliberate concealment of crown law. Throw him in the lowest cell of the Obsidian Keep. If he speaks, gag him. Thorne's face drained of all color. The arrogance vanished, replaced by the pathetic, wide-eyed terror of a coward stripped of his armor. Julian, you cannot do this! The council will rebel! The envoys are in the courtyard! Take him, Julian said. The guards seized Thorne by the arms. The former Grand Chancellor struggled, his black robes tearing, as they dragged him out of the freezing study. His shouts echoed down the corridor, growing fainter, until the heavy oak doors of the east wing slammed shut. Silence returned to the room. Julian stood alone. He looked down at the broken gold chain of the Chancellor. He had excised the rot from his court. He had finally taken accountability for the lies that poisoned his reign. But it was not enough. Punishing the liar did not undo the lie. Throwing Thorne in a cell did not put gold in the royal vaults. And it did not erase the words Julian had spoken in the Grand Chandelier Hall. "You may sit with the servants in the lower gallery." Julian reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out the silver watch. He did not open it to check the time. He simply held it, feeling the cold metal against his palm. The envoys of the Iron Bank were waiting. The sun was fully up. Oak Haven was officially bankrupt. There was no royal guard, no velvet coat, and no chancellor's trick that could save him now. There was only one path left. It was a path that stripped away every ounce of his sovereign pride. Julian turned away from the empty desk. He walked out of the freezing study, not toward the throne room, and not toward the foreign envoys. He walked toward the servants' stairwell. It was time for the Duke of Oakhaven to walk down into the dark. The descent into the lower galleries was a path Sovereign Duke Julian had never taken in his entire life. He bypassed the grand marble staircases of the East Wing. He ignored the gilded corridors lined with the portraits of his ancestors. Instead, he found the narrow, unmarked wooden door used by the scullery maids and the coal boys. He pushed it open and began to walk down into the dark. The air grew colder with every step. The scent of beeswax and heavy rose perfume vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of damp stone and burning wood. The walls here were rough, hewn, weeping with winter moisture. There were no chandeliers, only iron brackets holding flickering, smoking torches. Julian's silver-buckled boots clicked unevenly against the worn stone steps. He felt entirely exposed. Without Thorne whispering flatteries, without the high table elevating him above the crowd, he was just a man wearing a velvet coat that suddenly felt like a costume. He reached the bottom of the stairwell and stepped into the sprawling network of the palace kitchens. He expected to find chaos. He expected to find a disorganized mob of angry lords drinking cheap wine and shouting treason against his name. He found exactly the opposite. He found order. The massive soot-stained kitchen had been transformed. The hanging cuts of venison and strings of garlic had been pushed aside. Over the long, scarred wooden tables where the servants usually ate their porridge, heavy maps and financial ledgers were unrolled. The cooks and footmen stood quietly at the edges of the room, watching in silent awe. Around the tables stood the most powerful men in the sovereign duchy of Oakhaven. The Earl of the Western Ports was leaning over a shipping manifesto, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The Minister of Coin was furiously writing calculations on a piece of rough parchment, his velvet sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Lord Sterling, the commander of the vanguard, stood with his arms crossed, listening intently to a scout's report from the border. They were not plotting a rebellion. They were running the kingdom. And at the head of the largest table, sitting on a crude wooden bench, was Lady Clara. Julian stopped in the shadows of an archway. He could not breathe. He watched his wife. She was still wearing the plain, unadorned ash-gray silk gown. The hem was stained with flour and dust. The faint ink smudge was still visible on the edge of her white lace glove. Yet, sitting there in the smoke and the damp, surrounded by men who commanded thousands of swords and millions of gold coins, she did not look like a penniless ward. She looked terrifying. She looked ancient. She looked like a queen. Her warm hazel eyes were scanning a document handed to her by the Master of Laws. Her expression was calm, her posture perfectly rigid. She did not raise her voice. But when she spoke, every High Lord at the table stopped breathing to listen. Her worn leather portfolio rested on the table in front of her, closed and buckled, acting as the silent centerpiece of this makeshift court. Julian forced his legs to move. He stepped out of the shadows and into the flickering orange light of the massive kitchen hearth. "My lords," Julian said. His voice was rough. It lacked the booming, arrogant command he used in the Chandelier Hall. The low murmur of the kitchen instantly died. Lord Sterling placed a heavy hand on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, turning slowly to face the Duke. The Minister of Coin dropped his quill. The high nobles of Oakhaven looked at their sovereign, but there was no fear in their eyes. There was only the cold, hard judgment of men who had been forced to choose between a foolish boy and a competent ruler. No one knelt. No one bowed. Julian walked slowly toward the head of the table. The nobles parted, leaving a clear path between him and his wife. Clara did not stand up. She placed the document. She was reading face down on the scarred wood. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked up at Julian, and the banks of that long held fire in her eyes were steady and unblinking. "You found your way to the lower gallery, your grace," Clara said softly. "I am surprised. I was told the protocol of Oakham required you to stay in the light." Julian flinched as his own cruel words were handed back to him. "I arrested Chancellor Thorne," Julian said. He stopped on the opposite side of the wooden table. He looked down at the leather portfolio. "He is in the deepest cell of the obsidian keep. He forged the succession documents. He hid the truth of the 4th article from me. I did not know." "You did not ask?" Clara corrected him. The blade of her voice was completely smooth. "You ate the bread of this kingdom for 3 years, Julian, and you never once asked whose field it grew in. Thorne only fed you the lies you were already hungry for." Julian placed his gloved hands on the edge of the rough table. He bowed his head. "The Iron Bank is in the courtyard," Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The envoys demand the countersignature. They demand the true heir of the Eastern Realm. If they do not have it by mid-morning, they will freeze the ports. The duchy will fall." "I am aware of the schedule of our creditors," Clara replied. "Sign the treaty, Clara," Julian pleaded, looking up at her. The arrogant duke was gone. Only a desperate man remained. "I will restore you to the dais. I will exile Thorne permanently. I will give you whatever apologies you require. Just sign the extension." Clara looked at him for a long, terrible moment. She looked at the silver epaulettes that meant nothing. She looked at the deep, set gray eyes that were finally seeing her. Only because the alternative was his own destruction. Clara reached out. Her ink-stained glove brushed the heavy leather flap of the portfolio. "No," Clara said. Julian's breath hitched. "Clara, if you don't, I will not sign the survival of this kingdom in a soot-stained kitchen to save your pride." Clara said, her voice rising just enough to carry every noble in the room. She stood up. The ash-gray silk swept over the damp stone. She picked up the worn leather portfolio and held it against her chest. "You cast me out of the light in front of the entire realm, Julian," Clara said, her eyes locking onto his with absolute, unyielding sovereign power. "I will not fix your broken crown in the shadows." Julian stared at her. "Then what do you want?" "I want the high doors opened," Clara said. "I want the high court of nobles convened in the grand chamber. Every lord, every minister, every envoy of the Iron Bank. You will summon them all, and you will face me there, on the marble." She stepped around the table. Lord Sterling immediately stepped aside to make way for her. "If you want my signature, Julian," Clara said, pausing right beside him, "you will have to earn it in the light, and it will cost you far more than an apology." The high oak doors of the grand chandelier hall were thrown open. There was no string quartet playing from the balcony. There were no servants carrying silver platters of roasted meats. The crystal fixtures hung dead and unlit, catching the harsh, pale light of the winter morning that blood through the high-frosted windows. The room that had been a theater of vanity the night before was now stripped bare, transformed into the highest court of law in the sovereign realm. Sovereign Duke Julian stood on the dais. He did not sit on the high back throne. He stood beside it, his hands clasped behind his back. The midnight blue velvet coat still hung from his shoulders, but the heavy silver epaulettes no longer looked like armor. They looked like chains. He watched in silence as the high nobility filed back into the room. They did not take their seats at the banquet tables. They formed a wide, rigid semicircle at the base of the dais. Lord Sterling, the Minister of Coin, and the Master of Laws stood at the front, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, wearing long coats of black wool trimmed in severe iron gray, stood the 3 envoys of the Continental Iron Bank. They carried heavy ledgers bound in chains. They were the grim reapers of the sovereign world, and they were checking their pocket watches. Then the crowd parted. Lady Clara walked down the center aisle. She still wore the plain, unadorned ash-gray silk gown. The hem was visibly stained with the dust and soot of the kitchen floors. Her hair was still pinned back modestly. The faint smudge of ink was still visible on her white lace glove. She looked exactly like the woman Julian had banished to the shadows 12 hours ago. But as she walked, the high lords of Oakham bowed their heads. It was a terrifying, silent display of absolute authority. She did not wear a crown. She did not wear gold. She carried only the worn leather portfolio pressed against her chest. Yet the air in the grand hall seemed to bend around her. She was a woman who had survived the dark, and she was bringing it into the light. Clara stopped at the base of the dais. She did not bow. She looked up at the man who had ordered her to sit with the servants. Julian felt his throat close. He looked at the soot on her dress. He looked at the ink on her fingers. He felt the crushing, unbearable weight of his own blindness. "The High Court of Nobles is convened," Julian said. His voice was raw, echoing against the cold marble pillars. "I have summoned you all to witness a sovereign truth. The envoys of the Iron Bank shifted impatiently. Your Grace? The lead envoy clipped, his voice sharp. The grace period is over. We do not require courtly speeches. We require the countersignature of the primary guarantor, or we seize the royal treasury. The treasury is empty, Julian said flatly. A murmur rippled through the minor nobles at the back of the room, but the high lords who had been in the kitchen remained perfectly silent. The wealth of Oakhaven is an illusion, Julian continued, raising his voice, so it carried to the furthest corners of the hall. He did not flinch from the shame of it. For years, my father. And then my chancellor hid the truth of our survival. The sovereign treaty that keeps our ports open and our armies fed was not a charitable alliance. It was a lifeline. Julian stepped away from the throne. He walked down the velvet, carpeted steps of the days until he stood on the same level marble floor as Clara. Last night I allowed arrogance to rule my tongue, Julian said, looking directly into Clara's warm hazel eyes. I stood before this court and stripped my wife of her rightful place. I ordered her into the dark to appease the vanity of a court that was already drowning. He took a slow, deep breath. The entire kingdom was watching him. I was wrong, Julian said. Chancellor Thorne has been arrested for treason and the concealment of crown law. I stand before the Iron Bank and before my lords to issue a formal, public apology to the Duchess of Oakhaven. Clara, I ask you to take your seat on the dais. I ask you to sign the treaty, not as a ward, but as my equal. It was a staggering concession. A sovereign duke humbling himself before his court, admitting his absolute failure, and begging his wife for salvation. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the Chandelier Hall. The nobles waited. The envoys waited. Julian waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, hoping that this public sacrifice of his pride was enough to mend what he had broken. Clara looked at him. Her face was perfectly calm. The banks of the fire in her eyes did not soften. Slowly, Clara walked to a small marble table positioned between the nobles and the dais. She set the worn leather portfolio down. She unbuckled the heavy strap. Her ink-stained fingers reached inside, withdrawing the thick stack of ancient vellum with the heavy crimson wax seal of the Eastern realm. You offer me the seat of a Duchess, Julian, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but the absolute stillness of the room carried every syllable perfectly. I do, Julian said, with full honors. It is yours. Clara shook her head. The motion was small, elegant, and utterly devastating. You still do not understand, Clara said quietly. You think you can break a vow in public and mend it with an apology when the bill comes due. You think this treaty is a negotiation of feelings. It is not. It is the law. Clara unfolded the heavy vellum. She turned to face the envoys of the Iron Bank. Article 4 of the Sovereign Treaty. Clara read, her voice ringing out like struck iron. Should the ruling duke fail to honor the Eastern heir as a sovereign equal, the financial partnership is immediately and irrevocably voided. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. Clara, you did not just insult me last night, Julian. Clara continued, turning back to him. You publicly repudiated my standing before the highest lords of your realm. You gave a sovereign command. The treaty was broken the moment I crossed the threshold of the servants' corridor. The lead envoy of the Iron Bank stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. If the treaty is voided, then the debt is no longer guaranteed. Oakhaven is in default. Oakhaven is in default. Clara agreed, but the debt does not vanish. She smoothed her hand over the crimson wax seal. The rising phoenix of the annexed Eastern realm caught the pale winter light. Read the rest of the article, Master of Laws? Clara commanded, not taking her eyes off Julian. The Master of Laws stepped forward from the crowd. He bowed deeply to Clara, then recited the law from memory. In the event of a breach, the full sovereign debt of the Duchy of Oakhaven, along with all associated trade routes and land deeds held as collateral, reverts to the sole, independent ownership of the Eastern heir. The envoy of the Iron Bank stared at Clara, a new, sudden respect dawning in his harsh eyes. You hold the debt, I hold the debt. Clara confirmed. She turned back to Julian. The sovereign Duke of Oakhaven was shaking. He had offered her a seat beside his throne, completely failing to realize that she already owned the floor he was standing on. I am not a duchess, Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, terrifying royalty. I am Clarissa, the sovereign queen of the Eastern realm, and I do not accept your apology. Julian stared at her. The silence in the Grand Chandelier Hall was absolute. He had lost the treaty. He had lost the wealth. And standing before the woman in the soot-stained dress, he realized he had lost his kingdom. The Grand Chandelier Hall held its breath. There was no music to mask the tension. There was no whispered gossip to dilute the absolute. crushing weight of the moment. Sovereign Duke Julian stood before the woman in the ash-grey gown, surrounded by the highest lords of his realm and the ruthless envoys of the Iron Bank. He had nothing left. His wealth was a phantom. His chancellor was a traitor in chains. His sovereign authority, built on a foundation of hidden laws and forced marriages, had just legally shattered against the quiet dignity of a woman he had cast into the dark. "The debt is yours, Your Grace," the lead envoy of the Iron Bank said, bowing his head slightly toward Clara. It was the first time the foreign banker had shown respect to anyone in Oakhaven. "If you do not sign the extension, we will seize the palace and the ports to satisfy the arrears." Julian looked at Clara's ink, stained white-lace glove resting over the crimson wax seal of the Phoenix. She held the blade. She had every right to let it fall. She could let the Iron Bank strip House Valerius of its castles, its lands, and its history. She could let Julian become a beggar in his own capital, a fitting punishment for a man who had ordered his queen to eat with the scullery maids. But Clara did not look at the envoy. She looked at Julian. She was waiting. She had told him in the kitchen that he would have to earn her signature in the light, and it would cost him far more than an apology. Julian finally understood what she meant. A crown was not mended with words. An inherited theft was not cured by simply saying, "I am sorry." If he wanted her to save Oakhaven, he had to give her the only thing he had left. He had to give her his supremacy. Slowly, Julian reached up to his shoulder. His fingers gripped the heavy silver epaulette on his midnight blue velvet coat, the metal insignia of the Sovereign Duke. With a sharp, deliberate pull, he unfastened it. The silver hit the marble floor with a heavy, ringing clatter. A gasp rippled through the minor nobles at the back of the hall. Julian reached to his other shoulder and unfastened the second epaulette. He let it drop. Then he raised his right hand. He pulled the heavy gold signet ring of House Valerius from his index finger. The ring that sealed every law, commanded every army, and claimed ownership of the realm. Julian stepped forward and placed the signet ring on the marble table, right beside the worn leather portfolio and the Eastern Treaty. "I cannot offer you the seat of a duchess," Julian said, his voice stripping away the last remnants of his courtly pride, "because this palace, this land, and this court do not belong to me. My father stole your kingdom with a calendar and a cold note. I kept it with silence and arrogance." Julian took one step back. He looked at the high lords of the realm. He looked at Lord Sterling, whose hands still rested on his sword. He looked at the Minister of Coin, who was watching him with wide, trembling eyes. "Bear witness," Julian commanded the court. His voice was no longer the arrogant bark of a boy, but the grounded, painful resonance of a man choosing the truth over his own survival. Julian turned back to Clara. He lowered his tall frame. The velvet of his coat folded as his knee met the cold marble floor. Sovereign Duke Julian bowed his head before the ash-grey gown. "I surrender the sovereign claim of House Valerius," Julian said, his voice echoing clearly through the frozen hall. I acknowledge Clarissa of the Eastern Realm as the true and independent queen of this domain. I ask you to sign the ledger, not to save my throne, but to spare the people of this kingdom from the ruin my family created." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty ending, not with blood and fire, but with the quiet, devastating power of the law. Clara looked down at the man kneeling on the marble. She saw the broken silver epaulettes on the floor. She saw the heavy signet ring abandoned on the table. She saw the dark, exhausted circles under his deep-set gray eyes. He had burned down his own house, but in doing so, he had finally found his way out of the dark. Clara reached out. Her ink-stained fingers picked up the quill resting on the marble table. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She dipped the quill in the inkwell with the measured, flawless grace of a woman who was born to rule. She pulled the heavy ledger of the Iron Bank toward her. With smooth, sweeping strokes, she signed the parchment. She did not sign as a duchess. She did not sign the name of House Valerius. She signed Clarissa Regina, sovereign of the Eastern Realm, protector of Oakhaven. She pushed the ledger across the table toward the envoys. "The sovereign debt is secured," Clara said, her voice ringing out with unquestionable authority. "The ports remain open. The armies remain fed. You have your signature. Gentlemen, you may leave my palace." The lead envoy inspected the signature, closed the heavy ledger, and bowed deeply. "Long live the Queen," he murmured, before turning and marching his men out of the grand hall. Clara turned to the court. Lord Sterling did not wait for a command. The old military duke drew his ceremonial sword, holding the blade upright before his face. He dropped to one knee. The heavy clatter of his armor echoed against the pillars. "Long live the Queen," Lord Stirling roared. The Minister of Coin knelt. The Master of Laws knelt. The Earl of the Western Ports knelt. Lady Vivienne, her face pale and terrified, dropped into a deep, shaking curtsy. Row by row, wave by wave, the entire Grand Chandelier Hall bowed to the stone floor. They did not bow to a velvet coat. They did not bow to an illusion of gold. They bowed to the woman who had carried their survival in a worn leather portfolio, enduring their mockery, until the truth forced them to their knees. Julian remained kneeling at the base of the dais. He looked up at her. Clara looked down into his grey eyes. There was no magical, sweeping romance to erase the pain of the night before. There was only the raw, honest beginning of something real. He had lost his crown to find his conscience, and she had survived her humiliation to reclaim her world. "Rise, Julian," Queen Clarissa said softly, her voice meant only for him amidst the kneeling court. "The floor is cold, and we have a kingdom to rebuild in the light."